Hello, good people! Mighty Mordugal here, the miniature minstrel, your friendly gnome bard. Welcome to the channel. This will be my first video, so hopefully you'll enjoy it, but don't hold it against me. Alright, so the series that we're going to do here is going to be all about interpreting lore, people, and places of fantasy literature, games, shows, and movies, but we're going to do it all through Age of Wonders 4, which is what I've got up on my screen right now. So, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, what is Age of Wonders? Well, Age of Wonders, or AoW as people who have been playing it for years refer to it as, is a series of games by Triumph Studios, who started making their amazing high fantasy strategy and RPG-themed games in the late 90s and early 2000s. Now, the hallmark of these games is their great combination of grand strategy, tactical battles, and role-playing elements, all sort of wrapped into an original setting. In the early games, a fantasy setting for most of them, and then later also a sci-fi setting in Planetfall. And there's a heavy emphasis in these games on customization and replayability, which is really what makes these games so great. So Triumph Studios, who puts out these games, were originally an independent studio, and were for a number of years putting these games out. However, back in 2017, they joined with Paradox Interactive, a real titan in the strategy game development industry. And between the two of them, they've created Age of Wonders 4. So, in my view, the best game in the series thus far, because it gives you an immense amount of player agency and choice, the ability to build custom worlds, factions, and leaders, and characters. So you can create your own amazing fantasy story in the game, or if you choose to, recreate the people, places, and factions from your favorite fantasy novels, movies, shows, or other games. So you'll then lead that faction that you create and its heroes, and you'll explore and settle and expand your own fantasy kingdom, where you're going to wage war and conduct diplomacy against rival factions in what is a really, truly beautiful landscape, as you'll see here. Okay, so let's get into this. So we're going to create a new game.
Choose your destination.
And as I mentioned before, what's great about Age of Wonders 4 is the customization options. And that starts with the ability to create custom realms. Now, as you can see here to the left, there's a number of pre-made realms which you can choose from that the developers have already put in here. Some of these are a little more difficult than others. Some are designed for beginners. And then they do have story realms, which kind of follow a narrative and have some pre-made characters and special quests and that sort of thing in them. But what we want to really talk about is we want to talk about creating custom realms. And the options that you have are really fantastic. Some of the best that I've seen in any Fantasy 4X game. So you've got sort of basic settings here in terms of your player distance, that is how far each player will start from each other, how many players you can put in, difficulty, and also the turn system. So if you're doing multiplayer, you can do simultaneous turns, or you can do classic turns where everybody goes in order. But the customization is really, really impressive here. So you can select a number of different traits for a realm that you're going to create. So in this case, right, these are geography traits. So we've got a wide range of different options. Everything from essentially sort of desert worlds like this barren oceans to island worlds, and then some really kind of more extreme stuff like lava lakes, or a scarred divide, which, as you can see here, creates this sort of uninhabitable space on the map that you kind of have to traverse and you can't really use to build anything. But it doesn't stop there, because in addition to your geography traits, you also can select climate traits, which make the sort of environment itself different. So you've got, again, some things here that would change essentially the overall temperature and sort of kind of fauna and landscape that you would see in the game. So, deserts, you could do like a glacial frozen world if you wanted to, and each of these are going to come with kind of sort of little descriptions here that'll tell you kind of what you're getting into. But some of them, will have like multiple different things going on. So for instance, this one, forests are going to be common, desert and Arctic provinces are going to be really rare, and desolate provinces are absent, right? So this is a very lush kind of world. So after you selected your climate trait, so we'll go ahead and let's go ahead and choose the overgrown realm. So then, in addition to that, you can also choose what they're calling inhabitant traits. And so inhabitants are sort of the denizens of the world, the creatures and plant life and things that you're going to encounter. So there's quite a few options here. You can see some pretty interesting ones. You can do, sort of dragon themed worlds where there's going to be dragon infestations. And so infestations is something we'll talk about as we get into the game a little further. But the bottom line is these are entities that are going to generate sort of enemy armies, NPC armies that you're going to have to clear and fight during the game. Some of these kind of affect your cities, or what free cities are available. That is to say, sort of non-player character factions that are not major factions with a lot of power, but are only a single city. There's things like magic origins. So you're going to see a lot of creatures that are of a magical origin in that realm. You can create sort of death worlds where you have a lot of undead units that are present and that sort of thing. Lot of different options in here. So we'll just go ahead and we'll just throw one here. So let's just take the magic origins, and then this trait here is called a presence trait. And basically what these are sort of kind of pre-made kind of specialty enemies that are going to be the focal point of this world. So in this case, with the domain of the Frost Queen, you can see here, the whole realm is going to be dominated by this very powerful adversary that you're going to have to fight. Her name's Arctica. She's going to start with a very large city. She's also going to get 2 additional cities wherever you only are going to be able to start with your 1. And then all of the people that work for her minions, her troops, are all going to have this Frostling transformation. This is a unique thing for this particular realm created by the developers. And so transformations is something that we'll talk about also as we get into things. But essentially what transformations do is they sort of change the way that your faction's troops play. It changes elements in some cases physically, and also in their capabilities in terms of the troops that you're able to use when you're recruiting troops. So for instance, this Frostling transformation is going to give you your troops frost resistance. They're going to be immune to any kind of frozen spells. They're also going to have much higher morale when they're in sort of that cold, icy terrain. And then they're going to be able to traverse that same kind of terrain much more quickly. So we're going to leave this off for now. I just want to kind of show you some of this stuff. But we're not done yet, because then you can add in additional miscellaneous traits. And so there's a couple of different categories of these. So you've got sort of environmental effects, right? So Arctic blizzards, if you want to add in sort of weather effects that are kind of, if you want to do a frozen realm. The game does have an underground system, right? So this is like essentially you can get effectively 2 maps in one by choosing like massive underground, which gives you a full playable underground space. And there'll be passageways that you can use to pass between the underground and the overground. You can also do a sort of smaller version of that. But there's other stuff that's kind of crazy in here that'll really, really dynamically change the game as you're going through it. And so in this case, like Warping Wilds, it's actually going to have the provinces on the surface of the world. So the sort of provinces are the places that you're going to capture and will be sort of attached to your city, or that you can build new cities in. And with this Warping Wilds, they're going to have a chance to basically, if they're not owned by anybody, to change every turn. And so it could go from, say, a forest into a desert, for example. A lot of other stuff in here. Then you're getting into sort of modifiers for the different free city states that you're going to encounter. So these minor kind of factions, which will only have a single state or a single city. But in this case, this kind of changes how some of those free cities operate, some of the traits that they have, how you will interact with them, and sort of whether they're going to be hostile to you or they're going to be friendly right off the bat. So quite a few of those, and you can even, for instance, if you don't want to have any free cities at all, you can turn it off. So pretty interesting there. There's also, again, more to it. So there's rule modifiers that you can do, right? So in this case, the one I'm looking at is regenerating infestations. Nests of creatures that you're going to have to face that are called these infestations, are going to emerge frequently, so every 10 turns. So this is sort of a constant thing. So even if you go in and you clear one out, another one will emerge somewhere randomly in just 10 turns. You can also do things for unit modifiers, right? So these are traits that, as part of the map, as part of the world that you create, going to change aspects of the actual creatures that you're going to fight, the troops and beings that you're going to fight in the game, right? So gigantism, for instance, the beings of the realm are lower in number, but they are especially large, right? So marauder units, which are sort of hostile armies, which in some cases are sort of stationary and guarding resources, and then in some cases are sort of roaming around. So this gigantism will turn those units basically into very large versions of themselves with greater hit points and sort of and an additional attack, a retaliation attack, so that when you attack them, they're going to hit you not once but twice. Lots of other things that you can do in here, and we'll work through some of those when we set up our custom realm here in a minute. But you can do multiple of these, so you can have up to 4 of these different traits in here. Now, some of them are not compatible with others. So, for instance, small underground. This one's going to be mutually exclusive with that massive underground that's above it, and it's also incompatible with uninhabitable underground, which is a trait that you would have been able to select earlier as well. Okay, so now having gone over all of these traits and sort of things that you can do to change the realm, I want to sort of get into this custom realm that I've actually already created and just kind of walk you through it. So what we'll do is we'll go back.
Choose your destination.
So the theme that we're going to go for this particular playthrough is that we're going to reach into some Tolkien lore here. And if you're a Tolkien nut like me, who has read all the books, including the the Silmarillion and Children of Hurin and sort of even the History of Middle Earth series written by J.R.R. Tolkien's son Christopher Tolkien, the whole idea is here is through Age of Wonders 4 is because of the uniqueness of the realm creation and the faction creation capabilities in here. You can bring some of these things to life, sort of in your own sort of interpretation of things that you read, in really any fantasy genre or a movie or another game. And so for our realm today, we're going to pull some inspiration from the Silmarillion, which is the creation story. For those of you that aren't familiar with Tolkien's works as much, he had written a whole lot of papers and drafts of the sort of legendarium that would form the foundation of and sort of the history of Middle Earth, that eventually will of course culminate in what most people are familiar with, which is the more famous books like The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But it goes much, much deeper than those books. And if you read the Silmarillion, you're basically reading the creation story of Middle Earth. And so in sort of Tolkien's writings, he refers to the world that he has created as Arda. And this includes both the Middle Earth, where, most fans of, say, the movies or the Lord of the Rings books would be familiar. This would be Middle-earth, but it also includes sort of the Undying Lands, which are referenced by the Elves in both the books and the movies, for those that haven't read any of the books. And this is the realm, effectively, of the gods, right? So in Tolkien's Legendarium, there's essentially these deities. There is an ultimate deity, the creator, who basically creates everything else, and his name is Eru Iluvatar. And in the very beginning, he essentially, much like we're doing right here, he begins to sort of want to create a realm and to sort of bring beings with a life force into it. And so he starts by creating these sort of demigods, which are referred to as the Valar. And they're both male and female, and they typically are tied with sort of aspects of sort of nature, connections with the stars, connections with the ocean, and that sort of thing. You know, sort of things that, you know, in more modern fantasy, you know, you would refer to as sort of druidic sort of aspects. But what he does is basically he creates these beings, and then those beings themselves, the Valar, they begin to create Arda, which is the world in which Middle-earth will then sit. It's sort of the, if Middle-earth is, you know, sort of the main continent, then Arda is the actual globe, right? It's the actual world, and it includes these, at the earliest point, these Valar, these demigods. And you know, so the leader of them is Manwë, and he is essentially the Lord of the Skies and Winds, you know, and sort of has a lot of winged birds and stuff as part of his sort of elements of creation that he goes into creating Middle-earth with the rest of the Valar. And they're all doing it sort of through this music. It's called the Music of the Ainur in the Silmarillion. And at any rate, I'm taking inspiration from some of this, and there's a whole lot of different events that happen over the course of the Silmarillion, but this isn't necessarily a lore video about the Silmarillion. I want to take a snapshot of sort of a space and time in the Silmarillion and sort of use a little bit of artistic license and interpretation to kind of think about what that would have looked like. And so there's a period in time in this creation story where the sun and the moon have not yet been created. And instead, the world that would become Middle-earth is actually sort of bathed in eternal night, and the only light is from the stars. And so the whole idea with this realm creation is I wanted to take this point in history of the Silmarillion, where essentially it's after the Trees of Valinor have been destroyed. And so the light that was sort of bathing the world has gone out. And it has gone out because one of these Valar, named Melkor, whom the Elves will later name Morgoth, is a real evil being, and has essentially the very nasty creature named Ungoliant, which, if you have watched The Lord of the Rings and you've seen Shelob, effectively Shelob is the descendant of Ungoliant. So think even bigger and badder and worse than Shelob. And they've gone and they've destroyed the Trees of Valinor in the uttermost west. And so for a while the earth is dark, and the only light comes from the stars in the sky. And it's during this period, essentially, when two of Tolkien's original peoples arise, right? And so there are the Eldar, or the Elves, which are the most famous of all of his creations, perhaps aside from the Hobbits. And the whole idea is that this, as the story goes, that they are born essentially on the Lake of Cuiviénen, this very kind of mystical lake in the sort of easternmost regions of Middle-earth. And so you get the impression when you're sort of reading the Silmarillion about this period in time when the elves awake as the first children of Iluvatar, Iluvatar being the only one who can actually create life. You get the sense that they're a little bit there's a bit of a primitiveness to them until the Valar basically come and bring many of them to Valinor, and sort of raise their culture. There's lots and lots of different tribes and types of elves in Tolkien's Legendarium. We're not going to get into those, but just know that they are considered to be the first children. And then there are also a second group that awake sometime after the elves awake, and these are the dwarves. Now, the history of the dwarves is interesting because effectively one of the Vala, which I've already described to you, his name is Aule. He's a great smith and worker of metals and earthen materials. And he's a craftsman, and so he has this idea that he wants to basically create this race of beings that will sort of embody his love of the craft. And so he actually creates the dwarves effectively before the elves are born. But because he can't actually give them life, he sort of can only manipulate them when he is sort of working with them and speaking to them. And, imagine, if you will, a child sort of, giving life to their toys and sort of, talking and moving them around and that sort of thing. That's the impression you get. And then Iluvatar, the creator, as we've mentioned, sort of discovers the fact that Aule has created these dwarves. But the time is not yet appointed as Iluvatar is concerned, and that his plan does not involve the dwarves essentially at all. But he sees the amount of effort and love that Aule has put into the creation of these beings, and so he agrees essentially to give these creatures life. But not yet, not at the moment that Aule creates them. And so instead, what he tells Aule to do is he tells him to essentially await the appointed time to lay them by, and then they would awake shortly after the first children, which are the elves. So as the story goes, and I'm doing this as much as a paraphrase as I can because it's very, very dense lore. And this is not a sort of lore video in the sense that that's what this is all about, because there's lots of great lore videos that you can get out there. I recommend sort of Men of the West. That's a YouTube channel that specializes in Lord of the Rings lore, and so if you want to learn any more about that kind of stuff, I highly recommend you check them out. But at any rate, just to kind of move us along, so where we're going to start is we're going to start at this point where essentially it's right after Iluvatar, the creator, wakes up the elves. And shortly after that, we don't know when, at some point, he also wakes up the dwarves, whom Aule has essentially buried throughout Middle-earth. Now, as sort of Arda is described at the time, right? So this is Arda Under the Stars, essentially. This is the time before the moon and the sun. And so I wanted to invoke that. And so you can see, as from the traits here that have popped up, I have tried to replicate and sort of interpret the descriptions that you get from reading Tolkien about sort of what Arda was like at this time of sort of darkness with only starlight. And so you can see some of the ones that we have selected here. We're going to do an all land map. So it's just one large landmass, because early on in the history of Middle-earth, there's actually a whole section of the Western Middle-earth which exists that if you haven't read the Silmarillion, you wouldn't even necessarily know ever existed, because by the time the Lord of the Rings, the events in the Lord of the Rings happen, this land, which is known as Beleriand, has actually already been destroyed and has sank into the sea, effectively. And there's an apocalyptic event, essentially, where the Valar come and basically fight Melkor, this evil Valar that I've mentioned before. And as a result of that, there's this huge sort of cataclysmic event which destroys like the western portions of Middle-earth. And essentially, we're looking at a time period right now which is before that happens. And so the land mass of Middle-earth is actually much bigger at this time than it would eventually be at the time of the Lord of the Rings. So we've chosen land, which means that we're sort of kind of looking at the idea is that we're not near the coasts of Middle-earth. We're sort of in the interior. We've also selected highlands, and I've chosen highlands because we're going to see a lot of mountains and hill country. And if you think about a young sort of forming geological realm, right? I mean, in Earth, in our own Earth's history, right? The further back you go, the more substantial the mountains are, right? And the more raw and large. If you look at the Appalachians in the United States, in the eastern United States, they're very low mountains now, but billions of years ago, they were actually quite high and have eroded over time. And so there's a lot of sort of kind of geologic activity that I think would have been happening at this stage of Arda's life cycle. And so I've chosen Highlands here to reflect that with all the mountains, especially when you consider that Tolkien references a number of different mountain ranges if you look at the maps or if you've read the works. I've also chosen wildlands, and the reason that I've chosen wildlands here is because there's descriptions in the Silmarillion, of creatures that sort of walk under the stars, and there's no sun yet, and so sort of growth has sort of been slow and halting for more sort of plant-based forms, but they're still out there. But essentially, that the idea is that the animals and creatures of Middle Earth at this time are much kind of larger, more ferocious, more primeval. That's the sense you get when you read the Silmarillion. I've then also selected, in this case, no free cities, and the reason I've chosen to do this is because I wanted to have a little bit more of a structure to this realm. And so the idea being is that I want to focus on the arising of the dwarves. So the 7 kindreds of the dwarves is what we're going to focus on. And I want to I've created each of them as sort of a main faction. And rather than sort of have a number of random kind of free cities popping up that maybe have peoples or races like, say, Ratmen or Molkin or something like that, which are available in the game popping up, I didn't want to sort of have those kind of crop up, because you get the sense from Tolkien's works in this and in the Silmarillion, in the history of Middle Earth by Christopher, that at this time the only sort of like kind of sentient peoples, right, those that are kind of advanced in their ability to communicate and they have formed societies and that sort of thing, are the elves and the dwarves. And the orcs themselves are sort of kind of cruel sort of abominations and manipulations of captured elves and dwarves and that sort of thing. So we're not going to have any free cities in this. So we're only going to play with the kindreds that I've talked about. So you'll see some elves, you'll see some dwarves, and then we're going to see some orcs as well. I've also chosen lightless as a trait here. And the theme behind this is that we're talking about Arda Under the Stars. And again, this is a period in sort of the history of Middle Earth when there is no moon, there's no sun. And so the only light is coming from the stars. Now, the impact of this sort of in-game is it's going to decrease the vision range of our armies and our units. Now, this is going to be going to make it a little bit more difficult, because we're going to have to really use scouts and that sort of thing and watchtowers and that sort of thing to make sure that we can get early warning if we see any enemies. I've also chosen megacities, and I've chosen megacities because what we want to replicate here is we want to replicate what Tolkien describes as the mansions of the dwarves, right? So these are the gigantic sort of mountain cities that the dwarves create as they sort of form their societies. And so, the most famous of these, naturally, to just about anybody, who is familiar with even the movies, The Lord of the Rings, is Khazad-dûm in the Misty Mountains. But there are others, and there are earlier ones. And so, for instance, in the Silmarillion, 2 of the first megacities that basically arise of the dwarves are referred to as Novigrad and Belegost. And these 2 cities essentially exist in that western portion of Middle Earth, which, as I mentioned earlier, by the time of the Lord of the Rings has actually been destroyed for the most part. Or at least portions of it has. And so the remnants of those cities will sort of retreat. The remnants of those populations will retreat into the Blue Mountains, which is sort of the westernmost mountain range that you see if you look at a Tolkien map from the actual time of Middle-earth. So I've chosen megacities so that the different factions cannot create additional cities, and it's going to be this idea that you will have this one, large city that you operate out of, and that your whole people are sort of housed in. Practically in the game, what this does, it'll allow you to annex provinces, and we'll sort of show you how that works, which are the sort of sectors that you can attach to your city. But it allows you to annex these further away, and you can annex more of them as well. And then the final thing that I've selected to sort of to create Arda in this sort of time period is Crystalline Abundance. Now, this one's a little bit more sort of squishy. I'm taking a little bit more of an artistic license here and sort of kind of a little bit more of a radical interpretation. But the idea is because it's early in Middle-earth's history, and you have a lot of this geologic activity, my theory is all of the minerals, things like iron and silver and gold and that sort of thing that make the dwarves famous, the mining and delving and crafting and smithing of these resources, and the elves for that matter, would be very abundant at this time in the history of the Lord of the Rings. And so that's why I've chosen this Crystalline Abundance, which is going to allow us to have, there's going to be more mana resource nodes, which mana in the game will fuel your magical spells that your heroes and that your leader can cast. And it also is a currency that you can use to build certain buildings, and also to create certain summoning units, for instance, from magic. So anyway, so this is going to be Arda Under the Stars. That's the realm. I chose this kind of, hazy blue sort of image with the mountains in the background, kind of shaded under the dark sky. And then there's a lot of references in the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings to various lakes and sort of inland bodies of water that have a lot of kind of cultural significance, and also just geographic beauty, natural beauty that Tolkien describes. And so we've created Arda Under the Stars.